Something is wrong with his medication, Han Yujin said, pulling the pill organizer out of her bag before anyone could stop her, hands steady despite the chaos breaking out around her. The dosage doesn't match what's written on this chart, and it hasn't for weeks. Jang Min-ho, gray-faced and swaying against his desk, tried to wave her off. I'm fine. Get back to your post. You are not fine, Yujin said, catching his arm before he could collapse fully, guiding him into the nearest chair with the brisk, unhesitating competence of someone who had caught 100 patients mid-fall in an ER bay. And whoever's been adjusting these numbers wants you exactly this unsteady. I need to know who has access to this pill organizer besides you. Across the room, Dr. Choi Sung-tae's face had gone very still. To understand how a temporary bodyguard shift ended with a nurse uncovering a plot to slowly poison the most powerful man in Seoul's pharmaceutical underworld, we have to go back 6 weeks. To the exhausted night Yujin took a job she never should have qualified for. Han Yujin had worked in the emergency department of one of Seoul's busiest public hospitals for 6 years, and by the end of most shifts, she felt less like a nurse and more like a container that had been emptied out and refilled too many times to hold its original shape. She loved the work, in the specific, complicated way people love things that are also slowly wearing them down. She was good at it, calm under pressure, quick with her hands, able to read a deteriorating patient's vital signs faster than most of her colleagues twice her seniority. None of that changed the reality of her paycheck, which never quite matched the 12-hour shifts, the mandatory overtime, the years of student loans from nursing school that had compounded faster than her raises could keep pace with. "You look like you haven't slept properly in a month," said Young Aram, a fellow ER nurse and Yujin's closest friend on staff, catching her nodding off in the break room during a rare, quiet stretch. "You need to take the leave you're owed. I need the overtime pay more than I need the leave," Yujin said, rubbing her eyes, already calculating the month's numbers in her head. Rent, her younger brother's university tuition, the modest but steady support she still sent to her parents in Daegu, all of it stacked against a salary that stretched thinner every year, despite the raises that were supposed to keep up with it and never quite did. It was through a private staffing agency specializing in medical security placements, 6 weeks before the confrontation in Min-ho's office, that Yujin first heard about an unusual opportunity, temporary private security work for a high-net-worth client with complex medical needs, requiring both a nursing license and basic security training, which Yujin happened to hold from a brief stint years earlier, working hospital security details during a period of civil unrest. The pay was, by a wide margin, the highest she'd ever been offered for anything. And the contract length, filling in for an ailing regular bodyguard nurse hybrid for what was described as several weeks, possibly longer, fit neatly around a leave of absence she'd finally, reluctantly, agreed to take from the hospital. "You're going to spend your break from a stressful job taking an even strangery?" "One," Ariam said, half laughing, half concerned, when Yujin described the offer. "I'm going to spend my break paying off 6 months of debt in 6 weeks, Yujin said. That math is hard to argue with, even if the job description is a little odd. She took the position without asking too many questions about the client's identity. Reasoning, with the practiced pragmatism of someone who had learned to prioritize survival over curiosity, that high-net-worth client with complex medical needs and a security detail simply meant a wealthy, private person uncomfortable with hospital setting, not an entirely unusual client type for the agency's line of work. She had no idea, accepting the contract, that the client in question ran one of Seoul's largest pharmaceutical distribution networks, or that beneath its legitimate manufacturing and supply operations, the organization moved considerably more dangerous product through the same channels, protected by a private security apparatus that made most corporate protection details look casual by comparison. She simply knew that the pay would clear her brother's tuition installment 3 months ahead of schedule, and that, after 6 years of emergency medicine, she could handle almost any medical situation a private client's needs might require. Jang Min-ho had run his family's pharmaceutical empire for 11 years, inheriting an operation that manufactured and distributed medications through a network of legitimate pharmacies and hospitals across the country, and beneath that legitimate surface moved considerably larger volumes of controlled substances through black market channels that supplied criminal networks across the region. For the last 2 years, Min-ho had been managing a chronic autoimmune condition that required careful, consistent medication to control, a diagnosis he had told almost no one about outside his personal physician and one trusted lieutenant, terrified of what the revelation would mean for an organization built on the assumption of his absolute, unshakable strength. An organization like ours doesn't survive a leader who looks fragile, Min-ho told his second-in-command, Oh Tae-yang, the week of his diagnosis, flatly. Rivals smell weakness before they smell blood. If word gets out that I need daily medication just to function normally, someone will decide that's the opening they've been waiting for. Since then, Min-ho had managed his condition with the same controlled, compartmentalized secrecy he applied to every sensitive aspect of his business. A private physician bound by both professional confidentiality and, Min-ho believed, personal loyalty. A rotating series of discreet nurse security hybrids hired through a specialized agency to monitor his medication and vitals without the household staff or wider organization ever fully understanding why a bodyguard needed medical training at all. You look exhausted more often than you used to, Tae-yang observed once. Carefully, one of the few people close enough to notice the pattern without understanding its cause. I sleep poorly. It happens to everyone eventually, Min-ho said. The same careful deflection he'd offered for 2 years, exhausting in its repetition but necessary, he believed, to the continued stability of everything he'd built. What Min-ho did not fully understand, in the weeks before Yoo-jin's temporary assignment began, was that his physician, Dr. Choi Sung-tae, a man Min-ho had trusted completely for over a decade, who had treated his father before him, who had never once given Min-ho reason to doubt his loyalty, had been, for the last 4 months, quietly and carefully altering the precision of Min-ho's medication regimen under duress from a rival pharmaceutical network that had discovered, through channels Sung-tae still didn't fully understand, both Min-ho's condition and a devastating piece of leverage against the doctor himself. No one sees me weak. No one helps me unless I decide the terms of that help myself. That had been Min-ho's rule since the diagnosis, a rule that had kept his organization stable through 2 years of careful secrecy, and had also, without his realizing it, left him dangerously isolated from the one kind of scrutiny that might have caught the slow, deliberate deterioration Sung-tae had begun engineering months before Yoo-jin ever walked through his gates. He did not yet know that an exhausted ER nurse, hired for a temporary contract she'd taken mostly for the paycheck, was about to notice something his trusted physician of over a decade had been carefully hoping no one ever would. Yoo-jin's first 2 weeks in Min-ho's household passed in careful, methodical adjustment to a role considerably stranger than anything her nursing training had prepared her for, monitoring a wealthy, guarded client's vital signs and medication schedule, while also, per the contract's unusual dual requirements, maintaining basic physical security awareness during his more sensitive meetings and appearances. She noticed the household's odd, careful secrecy around Min-ho's medical needs almost immediately, though she initially assumed it reflected simple, wealthy client privacy preferences rather than anything more concerning. What did concern her within her first 10 days was a growing unease about the specific dosing schedule Dr. Sung-tae had left for her to administer. Small, incremental adjustments to the timing and quantity that cross-referenced against her own careful nursing notes on Minho's daily symptoms didn't track the way a properly managed chronic condition should. "You seem more fatigued today than your chart from 3 days ago would predict," she mentioned to Minho directly. On day 12, checking his vitals with the same brisk thoroughness she brought to every ER patient. "Has anything changed in how you're feeling generally?" "I'm managing a demanding schedule," Minho said, the same practice deflection he offered everyone. "Fatigue comes with the job." "It might," Yoojin said carefully, unwilling to simply accept an answer that didn't match what her training told her about his specific pattern of symptoms. "But I'd like your physician's actual reasoning for the recent dosage adjustments, if you don't mind me asking. Some of the timing changes don't follow the logic I'd expect for your condition." It was a small, professional question, delivered with none of the deference the rest of the household extended reflexively to anything connected to Minho's medical care, and it was the first moment Minho registered, with mild surprise, that his temporary nurse bodyguard treated his condition as a clinical problem to be solved, rather than a fragile secret to be carefully managed around. The moment that truly changed everything happened during a tense business dinner 3 weeks into Yoojin's contract, when Minho, mid-negotiation with a visiting supplier, suddenly went pale, his hands trembling in a way that had nothing to do with the conversation's tension, his speech beginning to slur slightly in a manner every other guest at the table either failed to notice or carefully avoided acknowledging. Yoojin moved before anyone else in the room had finished processing what was happening, crossing to his side with the same unhesitating urgency she brought to a collapsing ER patient, checking his pulse and pupils with brisk, practiced hands while quietly, firmly instructing the room to give them space. "This isn't fatigue," she said, low enough that only Minho and his closest aide could hear. "This looks like a medication reaction, and it's happening faster than it should for whatever dose you're supposed to be on. I need to get you somewhere private, now." She guided him from the table with a calm, unhurried authority that broked no argument. The visiting supplier and other guests left staring, uncertain what had just occurred, while Minho's aide scrambled to smooth over the interruption, with vague explanations about a scheduling matter. Once safely in his private study, Yoojin checked his vitals again, the reaction already beginning to stabilize, though her unease had only sharpened. "Who manages your medication schedule day to day?" she asked. "Because either your condition has changed significantly without your physician updating your care plan, or something about that plan itself has changed without your knowledge." Minho stared at her, breathing slowly returning to normal, something in his exhausted, guarded expression shifting into genuine attention. "Who are you?" he asked, "that you noticed something my own physician of over a decade apparently hasn't." In the days following the dinner incident, Minho, against every instinct that had governed his careful management of the condition for 2 years, began involving Yoojin directly in decisions about his care, a shift that unsettled his usual small circle of trusted staff, none of whom understood the full extent of what had actually happened at the dinner, only that the temporary nurse bodyguard had somehow earned unusual access in its aftermath. "You could have simply followed the existing medication chart without question," Minho said during one of their now regular morning check-ins. "Most people in your position would have. It would have been considerably less complicated for you. I didn't take a nursing job to follow charts that don't match the patient in front of me." Yujin said. If something's wrong with how your condition is being managed, staying quiet about it doesn't protect you. It just makes me part of the problem instead of part of the solution. It was during one of these sessions that Yujin refused, for the first time, to be handled the way Minho's household typically handled anything connected to his condition, with careful, indirect management designed to avoid direct, uncomfortable acknowledgement of how serious it actually was. Minho had, testing the boundary the way he now tested most new proximity to his private life, suggested that Yujin simply monitor him quietly going forward, without raising further questions to Dr. Sung-tae directly, preferring to handle any necessary confrontation himself, privately to avoid unsettling the household further. No, Yujin said plainly. If there's a real discrepancy in your care, it needs to be investigated properly, not managed quietly to protect anyone's comfort, including yours. I've spent 6 years watching what happens when people prioritize keeping things calm over asking the hard questions a patient's safety actually requires. I'm not doing that here. Minho, surprised by his own reaction, found himself relieved rather than offended by the refusal, a small, strange relief he hadn't expected to feel from someone he'd known for less than a month. One evening, reviewing his symptom history together at length, Minho told her something he had never told anyone outside Dr. Sung-tae and Taeyang. I've spent 2 years terrified that if my organization learned the truth about this condition, someone would use it against me before I could protect myself, he said quietly. I built every part of my care around absolute secrecy, assuming secrecy itself was the protection. It never once occurred to me that the secrecy might be exactly what let something go wrong without anyone qualified enough to notice catching it in time. Secrecy protects you from people finding out, Yujin said. It doesn't protect you from the people you've already let close enough to manage the secret. Sometimes those are the same danger, just from a different direction. Minho was quiet for a long moment, something behind his careful exhaustion shifting into a kind of wary, unfamiliar hope. You think Sung-tae is the problem, he said. It wasn't quite a question. I think the numbers don't match what a decade of trusted, competent care should look like, Yujin said carefully. I don't know why yet, but I know enough about medication management to know this isn't simple oversight anymore. Dr. Choi Sung-tae had served as Minho's personal physician for 11 years, having treated Minho's father before him, trusted with a level of intimate medical access that made him one of the few people in the organization who fully understood the extent of Minho's condition and its careful management. 4 months earlier, Sung-tae's teenage daughter had been the target of a carefully orchestrated threat from a rival pharmaceutical network, the Baeka Group, longtime competitors seeking to weaken Jang Min-ho's territorial control over the region's controlled substance distribution, a threat delivered with chilling specificity, detailing his daughter's school schedule, her daily route home, and a clear, unmistakable message: cooperate quietly with careful, incremental adjustments to Minho's medication regimen, timed to gradually weaken and destabilize him over months rather than through any single dramatic incident that might trigger suspicion, or the next message would not be a warning. Sung-tae had told himself, in the terrified weeks after the initial threat, that small, gradual adjustments, nothing dramatic, nothing immediately traceable, simply careful drift away from optimal management, represented the only way to protect his daughter without directly, catastrophically betraying a man whose family he had served loyally for over a decade. He had convinced himself, in his most desperate moments, that Minho's decline would remain slow enough, subtle enough, that no one would ever trace the true cause, allowing Sung-tae to eventually find some other way out of the Baeka Group's leverage without anyone getting seriously hurt. Yujin's arrival, and her stubborn, clinical refusal to accept unexplained symptoms without investigation had unraveled that fragile calculation far faster than Sung-tae had planned for. The new nurse is asking pointed questions about the dosing schedule. Sung-tae told his Becca group contact, voice tight with panic, during a call he made from his car, parked several blocks from his own clinic to avoid any possibility of being overheard. She caught the reaction at the dinner. If she keeps investigating, she'll find the pattern, and it traces directly back to me. Then make sure she stops investigating, the contact said, coldly. And Sung-tae, sick with a fear that had already cost him more of himself than he could bear to examine closely, understood exactly what that instruction was likely to mean. Yujin, for her part, had begun noticing things about Sung-tae in the days since the dinner that unsettled her without yet fully cohering into a clear picture. His visible nervousness whenever she raised specific questions about dosage timing, the way he avoided direct eye contact during their now tense case reviews, a particular, hollowed-out exhaustion in his face that Yujin recognized, uncomfortably, from patients she'd treated who were being coerced or abused and hadn't yet found the words to say so. Dr. Choi seems frightened of something, she mentioned to Minho once, cautiously, more than a simple disagreement about care would explain. I don't know your world well enough to guess what, exactly, but it doesn't read like ordinary professional defensiveness to me. Minho's expression sharpened. The same careful stillness Yujin had learned meant he was calculating something dangerous. Keep noticing, he said quietly, and made a call that evening that set a careful, deliberate investigation into Sung-tae's recent circumstances into motion. It happened 4 days later, entirely by accident. Yujin had stayed late, reviewing Minho's full medication history against her own careful clinical notes, cross-referencing every adjustment Sung-tae had made over the preceding months against Minho's documented symptoms, when a pattern she'd been circling around for days finally crystallized into something undeniable. Every adjustment, without exception, had trended in the same direction. Subtle, incremental changes that, individually, looked like routine clinical fine-tuning, but that, viewed together across 4 months, added up to a slow, deliberate weakening of Minho's stability rather than the careful optimization a decade of trusted management should have produced. She photographed the full comparison, hands steady despite her racing pulse, and brought the complete analysis to Minho that same night. This is an error, she said, laying the timeline out clearly. Errors don't trend consistently in one direction for 4 months without a single correction. Someone adjusted this deliberately. Minho went very still, the particular stillness Yujin had come to recognize as danger calculating itself behind his eyes. 4 months, he said quietly. That's around when Sung-tae's demeanor started changing. Tae-yang mentioned it to me weeks ago, and I dismissed it as stress. That same night, before either of them could act further, Sung-tae, sensing the walls closing in around him, made one final, desperate move, under continued pressure from his Baeka group contact, attempting to remove Yujin from the situation entirely before her analysis could be formally presented to Minho's organization, sending 2 men to intercept her as she left the estate for a rare evening off. Yujin fought back with the same unhesitating, practiced physicality that 6 years of managing volatile ER patients had trained into her instincts, driving her elbow hard into one attacker's throat and twisting free before either man could force her into the waiting car, screaming loud enough that Minho's security detail, patrolling more closely than usual since the day she'd first flagged Sung-tae's fear-driven behavior, arrived within 90 seconds, subduing both men before they could complete the attempt. She was shaking, bruised at the wrist, unharmed but deeply rattled, when Minho arrived minutes later, his usual careful composure entirely gone, replaced by something raw and furious that Yujin had never seen on him before. Sung-tae, he said, the name landing like a verdict. Minho called Sung-tae to his estate that same night, calmly, without revealing what awaited him, and Sung-tae arrived already unraveling, sensing, in the careful stillness of the summons, that something had shifted beyond his control. "Sit down," Minho said, and Sung-tae sat, hands visibly trembling. 4 months ago, Minho began, laying the medication timeline across his desk with unhurried precision. Your demeanor changed. Tonight, someone sent 2 men to remove the nurse who noticed the pattern in your dosing adjustments before I did. I'd like to know what happened 4 months ago, Sung-tae, and I want the truth, because right now, the evidence in front of me suggests you've spent that time slowly, deliberately weakening me. Sung-tae's composure collapsed entirely. "They threatened my daughter," he said, voice breaking. "Baeka Group. They knew everything, her school, her schedule, exactly how to reach her if I didn't cooperate. I told myself small adjustments wouldn't really hurt you, that I could find another way out before it went too far. And I kept telling myself that for 4 months, while it kept getting worse instead of better." Minho was quiet for a long, heavy moment, something complicated moving behind his controlled expression. Fury, certainly, but also, unmistakably, a flicker of something closer to grief for a decade of trust, now irreparably altered. "You could have come to me the moment they threatened her," he said finally. "I would have protected your daughter completely, immediately, without hesitation. Instead, you let them turn you into a weapon against me for 4 months, and tonight, that weapon almost cost someone her life." Yoo-jin stepped forward then, not out of fear, but out of the same steady clinical instinct that had driven every part of her investigation. "The full medication comparison is already documented and secured with an independent source," she said quietly. "It shows exactly what happened, and when. Whatever comes next, the evidence isn't going anywhere." Sung-tae's face collapsed into something like relief, mixed with devastation, the specific exhaustion of a man finally releasing a secret that had been slowly destroying him from the inside for months. Minho's justice, when it came, was precise rather than violent. He immediately deployed his own considerable security resources to protect Sung-tae's daughter and family from any further threat from the Baeka Group, moving them to protected housing within hours. Not mercy for Sung-tae's actions, he made clear, but simple recognition that punishing a father for protecting his child, while ignoring the actual threat that had forced his hand, would only repeat the same failure that had let the situation happen in the first place. Sung-tae himself was removed entirely from any position of medical trust within the organization. His decade of service ended, though Minho, after a long, difficult deliberation, chose not to escalate the matter to violence against a man he judged, ultimately, a victim of coercion, rather than its architect. The full details of the Baeka Group's threat and coercion were, instead, quietly but thoroughly exposed to the wider criminal network's own internal power balances, ensuring the rival organization paid a far steeper price than Sung-tae ever could have. In the weeks after Sung-tae's exposure, something in Minho's household, and in Minho himself, settled into a shape it hadn't held in 2 years. Tae-yang, who had watched the unraveling with a mixture of relief and quiet awe, made a point of formally introducing Yoo-jin to the organization's inner circle not as a temporary contract worker, but as the person whose clinical instincts had likely saved Minho's life. Minho, for his part, made a change to his own management of the condition that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with a lesson Yoo-jin had taught him without ever intending to teach it. "I built 2 years of care around the idea that secrecy was the same thing as protection," he told her one evening, sitting on the estate's quiet terrace, his color and steadiness considerably improved now that his medication had been properly restored and independently verified by a new, carefully vetted physician. Secrecy just meant no one qualified enough was watching closely enough to catch it when something actually went wrong. You caught it because you refused to simply trust the chart in front of you. I never set out to catch anything specific, Yujin said honestly. I just noticed the numbers didn't match the patient and refused to let that go unquestioned. That's all this ever was. From where I was standing, that's not all it was, Minho said quietly. Not for a long time now. Weeks later, once her original contract's term had formally ended, Minho offered Yujin a permanent position as his personal medical director, full oversight of his ongoing care, generous enough compensation to clear the remainder of her debts entirely, with none of the secrecy or compartmentalization that had let Sungtae's coercion go undetected for months. You don't have to offer me a permanent position out of gratitude, she told him, testing the gesture the way she tested most offers that arrived too easily. I know, Minho said. I'm offering it because you're the best clinician I've encountered in 2 years of careful, secretive management that nearly cost me everything. And because, separately, but just as truly, I'd like you to stay in my life beyond a medical chart, if you're willing to let it become that. Yujin considered him for a long moment, thinking of 6 exhausting years in an ER that had never once let her rest long enough to imagine a different kind of life, and let herself, finally, imagine one now. I'd like that, she said, on the condition you never again let secrecy replace an actual, ongoing conversation about your care. I don't do quiet management, not anymore. And not for you. Months later, at a quiet dinner celebrating both Minho's fully stabilized health and the final payment on her brother's tuition, Yujin's parents visited from Daegu, sitting at a table with a man who had slowly learned that real protection required letting the right person see exactly how much help he actually needed. If Yujin's sharp clinical instincts and Minho's hard-won trust moved you the way it moved us, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments, did you suspect Dr. Sungtae before the discovery scene? Or did his betrayal surprise you completely? Stay close, because part 2 is coming, and the Becca group isn't finished yet.